Now I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Pamela Matson. Professor Matson is Dean of the Stanford School of Earth, Energy, and Environmental Sciences, as well as an internationally recognized interdisciplinary earth scientist, academic leader, and organizational strategist. Her research focuses on the consequences of agricultural intensification, land use change, and nitrogen deposition for ecosystems and the atmosphere, and on sustainable development issues in developing regions. Working mostly in the tropics, she and her colleagues have identified the negative consequences of deforestation and intensive agriculture for the global and local atmosphere, freshwater, and marine systems, and are working to develop new approaches that reduce those impacts while maintaining human livelihood and well-being. She also works on the vulnerability of food and water systems to climate change. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Pam. Welcome.
Well, welcome. Thank you very much for being here. I'm glad to have a chance to talk with you this morning. I'd like to talk about a framework and an approach for pursuing sustainability. And what I'm going to do is start with a little bit about motivation. Why would we be doing this? Why do we care? And then provide a framework for analysis and decision making, a framework that really anyone, any leader could use. I'll talk a little bit about why this is really hard, and then add a bit about the tools that we can use to help make good decisions for sustainability. So first of all, let me start with the question. Oops, there we go. Let me address the question, what does sustainability mean? Of course, this is a term that's used by many different people in many different situations, and it has different meanings. But there are a couple that matter to us in this context. It really emerged initially from the UN and from an ongoing discussion about how to help the poorest countries in the world develop and develop well socially and economically. Going back to the Brundtland Report in 1989, Our Common Future basically said, look, if we're going to meet the needs of people, we're going to be working on that very, very hard right now. How do we do that and still not forego opportunities for the future, not compromise the future ability of people to meet their own needs? And this has been worked on very, very hard over many decades. Today we have a new set of sustainable development goals that the UN put together last year through an engaged stakeholder set of discussions. And people and organizations and institutions around the world are working toward those goals. So that's sustainable development. But now what about corporate sustainability? This is another major emphasis that has engaged lots of corporations around the world over the last couple of decades. We think about the three-legged stool or the triple bottom line or the 3 E's to represent the fact that corporations are now trying to make decisions that make sense economically in terms of profit, but also socially and environmentally. And in many ways, this is now relevant to the ESG value system that many corporations are placing on their operations. So why do businesses engage in this? Lots of reasons, a lot of reasons having to do with internal business sustainability, with the well-being of the company in both the short and the long term. Lots of companies have engaged for efficiency savings. They've saved a lot of money by using resources more efficiently. Many are identifying growth opportunities in new markets that are related to using scarce resources more effectively for humans and human needs. There are reputational issues. There's certainly one way to attract, recruit, and retain motivated employees who care about the world, and lots of elements of risk management. But I think increasingly corporations are buying into this, are engaging in this because they are concerned, they and their leaders are concerned about the well-being of people beyond their own corporation. So it's about well-being then in both cases. And so I think we can, in a sense, define sustainability as with the goal of well-being of people today and in the future, of companies in this next quarter, but in the longer term, and of institutions and organizations and people here, but also all around the world. That's the definition we're using for sustainability's goal. So we're talking about then well-being, and then we can ask a question, what does well-being mean? And there's been an international conversation about this. What are the constituents of well-being? And absolutely at the top of the list are material needs. How do we meet the energy and food and water and shelter and material needs of people all around the world? But there's also well-being associated with access to health care, with access to education, with access to economic opportunities and to the opportunities to live well and to make profits, and security, the freedom of want and fear, and so on. These are all on the list. And when we make a list like that, we can then ask, how well are we doing in that list? How well have we succeeded so far in meeting the needs of people? And there's a lot of progress that's been made. We know, for example, that more people have access to more kilocalories today than ever before, so we're eating better. More people have access to health care than ever before, so infant mortality rates are in decline. The death of children under the age of 5, death rates have declined. The death rates of women in childbirth have declined. Lots of indicators there. And in terms of education, you know, the literacy rates have just skyrocketed. Most children today can read. So lots of progress. And maybe the best way, the best indicator for that is to look at life expectancies at birth. And when we think about that, look at the graph here. It shows life expectancies as they've changed from 1950 to 2010. In the developed countries of the world, we're now living 80 years or longer on average. And every country around the world has seen some increase in life expectancies. So that's a very good signal. But you can also see in this graph the real problem, and that is a huge disparity between people living in the wealthiest countries of the world and people living in the very poor parts of the world. And that disparity shows up in a number of different areas. We have today 1 billion people who can't read. They're mostly adult women. We have 1 billion without adequate shelter or access to safe water or to sanitation or modern forms of energy. Almost 1 billion people go to bed hungry a lot of times. And that's today, so a huge challenge there. But the planet is still growing. Our population is still growing. So let's take a quick look at that to get a sense for the issue. So Homo sapiens has been on the planet for a couple 100,000 years, but just over the last 7 or 8, 9,000 years, we've begun to grow. And it's because of, at first, because of settled agriculture, because of the domestication of animals, because people were living in settlements. And so by the time of Christ, we had something like 300 million people on the planet. We had grown. We continued to grow very slowly with more and more people living in dense areas and ran into some problems like the Black Plague. But in the 1800s, everything changed. Our population growth absolutely took off incredibly quickly. In fact, we are still growing. But we're not growing exponentially anymore. We are quite clearly going to level off at a global population level of 11 billion people or so, probably towards the end of this century or the early part of the next. That's a lot more people on the planet that we don't have today whose needs are going to have to be met, whose well-being is a concern for all of us. Now that population is not distributed evenly all around the planet, and the growth and change in it is not distributed evenly. So in this figure, you can see the red line towards the bottom is the population in the developed countries of the world. You can see they've leveled off. They're not growing. The green line shows the population changes in the less developed countries of the world, like in this case China and India and Indonesia, growing very rapidly at first, now within a decade or 2 or 3 of leveling off. And then in the bottom purple line, you see the continued increase in population growth in what are the very least developed areas of the world, the countries in sub-Saharan Africa, for example. So we can look at that and see where the changes are occurring and where people will need the most new resources and will need to work for well-being. The other point about this slide is that, or not in the slide actually, is that a lot of these people are living in cities now, more than 50% today, probably 70 to 80% by the end of the century. And even as population is slowing down and stopping, population growth is stopping, consumption is continuing, is increasing. And that is good because many people right now don't have access to enough things in the world. And many people around the world are moving into the middle class. So consumption will increase as well. So you look at those trends, and I hope you're all seeing huge opportunities in this, but also huge challenges. How are we going to meet the needs of that growing and more consuming human population? How are we going to do it in a way that can be sustained over decades and centuries? And what does this mean for all of the businesses in which we work? How do we work towards intergenerational well-being given this situation? So I'm going to show you right now a framework that was developed and published in this book called Pursuing Sustainability. It's just a primer. And this framework was intended for any leader, not just business leaders, as a way of thinking about the pursuit of sustainability. And at the top of the framework, we think about our goal, the goal of intergenerational well-being, of people here and around the world today and in the future. So how do we meet that goal? Well, through a whole bunch of production and consumption activities that we're all engaged in. We're creating the goods and services and trying to provide them for people to consume. We are the actors and agents doing that. And there's lots and lots of ways that we can do those things better or worse that will have an impact on long-term intergenerational well-being. We could spend hours talking through these things, but what we're going to do right now is move down to the underlying assets that control what we can produce and consume. We're going to talk about 5 capital assets that ultimately determine human well-being. So let's start at the top, natural capital. This is an asset. These are the people of the world, people in different places. It's the numbers of people, their demographics, their health status, their level of education and knowledge accumulation, all of the things that allow people, individual people, to be actors and decision makers. We have social capital. Those are our rules and regulations, the norms, the institutions, the networks that we use, the strategies, including financing strategies that allow us to move and make decisions for sustainability. Over on the other side of the graph, we have manufactured capital. This is everything we build, everything we make. It's our buildings, our factories, the stuff we make inside of the factories, the new technologies and tools. It's our roads and our airports and everything else that humans make. Over on the right, we have knowledge capital. And this is the kind of new knowledge that's created in places like Stanford University, other universities, research centers of companies and of governments. And it's also the knowledge that is obtained through practice and experience in the field or in the factory. Crucial to have that knowledge as we move ahead in a transition to sustainability. And then finally at the bottom is natural capital. This is basically our life support system. It's all of the resources that we call on in order to power that manufactured capital and to meet the needs of people. It's the it's the environment in which we live, our atmosphere, our climate system, and the species and ecosystems on land and in the oceans that provide so many of the things that we need. So that's natural capital. Those 5 capital assets underlie our ability to meet our goal of well-being. And the bottom line is if they go down, if we lose them, or if they're declining, then we're in trouble if our goal is to worry about the future as well as right now. So I would, in a normal kind of classroom environment, I'd ask you right now, which of these capital assets do you think is under most stress? Which ones are declining? And some of you would say social capital. You would say, without the rule of law, we can't make any progress. And you'd be right. Others might say, well, it's manufactured capital. We don't have the right infrastructure to allow these new technologies to take off. And you'd be right there too. But if you're thinking globally, the answer is natural capital. Globally, there is no doubt that our whole range of natural capital assets are in decline. And it's not hard to see why. If you go back to this population growth graph and you look at that dramatic increase, we had in 1800 we had 1 billion people. By 1924 we had 2 billion people. By the 1950s we had 3 billion people. Now we have 7.4 billion and we're going to 11. If you look at that graph and how quickly that happened, you can kind of understand why our life support systems have been under stress. I mean, we've been in a mad dash to meet the needs of people. And we've done that pretty well. We've met needs for energy by using biomass and most especially fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas. We've met the needs of people for food through some wonderful new technologies that increased yields, also converting lands, natural lands to agriculture. And we've kept food production at pace with human population growth. We've met the needs of people for water, for a whole range of different uses, by building reservoirs, by pumping aquifers, by using water in rivers. And we've succeeded in all of these things and many more. However, many of those efforts have had unintended negative consequences. In a sense, we didn't take the time to worry about the impact on natural capital. So burning of fossil fuels, absolutely crucial for meeting energy needs, and yet is leading to very high emissions of air pollutants and greenhouse gases. Likewise, greenhouse gases, methane, nitrous oxide, carbon dioxide coming from agriculture, and those together add up to a global change in temperature that we are seeing right now. There's absolutely no doubt of that. And that temperature change is having a range of impacts, things like very heavy precipitation events and flooding, or extended droughts, or sea level rise, or increased storminess, that ultimately affect our ability to meet the needs of people. So they affect our sustainability goals. And climate isn't the only thing. There's a whole long list of ways that our natural capital is being degraded. And again, we could spend a lot of time focusing on the different items in this list, but I'm going to move on to say the real challenge here is to change that downward arrow for natural capital to an upward arrow while still meeting the needs of people, while still paying attention to the well-being of our people and our organizations today as well as in the future. And I think we can do that. There are fantastic examples right now of companies engaging in doing exactly that, and we'll come back to that in a minute. I want to tell you a quick story about how our efforts to meet the needs of people have had unintended consequences, and then we'll go to some stories of where things are going in the right direction. So the Green Revolution took place in the 1950s through the 1990s. Really a group launched by a group of academic scientists as well as non-governmental organizations who recognized that human population was growing very quickly and there was no way we could meet the food needs of those people without changing the way we do things. So they they've invested and created a number of new technologies, improved genetic materials of the cereal crops, new ways to carry out irrigation, new kinds of industrial fertilizers, new pesticides, new mechanization. And as you would recognize, a lot of those new technologies launched companies, or rather companies launched those new technologies. Huge advancement there. course, the new technologies themselves weren't going to be enough. The people in the field had to know how to use them. So both the companies and the non-governmental organizations began to invest in human capital, training farmers, making sure that they have the education needed in order to employ those technologies. And that whole system yielded a fantastic result. We were able to keep food production at pace with that very rapid human population growth. Really wonderful. But one problem was that nobody was really paying a whole lot of attention to the drawdown on natural capital. The soil resources, the effect of fertilizers on water systems, the use of water for irrigation and overpumping of aquifers, air pollution problems, greenhouse gas emissions, and on and on. Again, changes that affect our ability to meet the needs of people for food in the future. So that went down. There was also a bit of a drop in social and natural capital in some places as whole communities, especially indigenous groups, lost their land and lost their ability to play. Well, since then, all of our efforts, and I'd say in the last couple of decades, have been trying to reverse that. How can we do this differently? How can we still grow enough food, engage enough companies, and engage enough individuals to meet the needs of people, but without those negative unintended consequences? And there are great stories. I'm going to just share one story, and that is the story of the Sustainable Harvest coffee importers, because I think it illustrates paying attention to all of these assets. So David Griswold, the founder, in the 1980s, soon after college, I guess, volunteered by working with poor coffee farmers in Mexico, and he began to see how difficult their lives were, how challenging it was, despite all their hard work, for their well-being to increase. And he decided later to create a business that would help them improve their well-being, but would also be profitable. So what did he worry about? He worried about finding that knowledge capital and creating that new knowledge that they could employ in technologies in the field, so manufactured capital, that would allow the farmers to get more value for the crops that they were growing, that would allow them to reduce the costs of fertilizers and add more of the resources they had at hand, including organic fertilizers, that would reduce the environmental consequences of what they did. He recognized, again, that you can have the new technologies, but people need to know how to use it. Farmers were engaged, were involved in learning and training and using and improving those technologies. So he worked with the capital asset of human capital, and he made sure, and his teams made sure, that the natural capital wasn't declining and actually was improving because of these processes. He also focused on supply chain dynamics, increased the transparency of the supply chain so that those poor farmers actually understood where their coffee was going and who was making money on it, and built a trust and a long-term consistency in the supply chain that pays that back over time. Ultimately, producing a lot of coffee, increasing the well-being of the people there, and creating a profitable company. The story is not over, and it could go on, but it gives you an idea of what one corporation can do. So I think the challenge for all of us is to think about how we manage all of these assets and their interactions in ways that promote intergenerational well-being. And again, what I would do in a classroom situation, if you were all sitting here with us today, is ask you to apply the framework to your challenge, to your business challenge. In a way, it's a way of thinking about the problem. It's a checklist to remind us not to forget really important assets as we make our plans. But you can take that home and do it later. So I have to be truthful in saying this is not as easy as it sounds. This is a really hard problem, and it's because these systems are very, very complex. They are not simple linear relationships among the different components of them. So just briefly, let me say a system is. We talk about complex systems. A system, as defined by a huge field of inquiry, of the systems thinking, systems dynamics, systems engineering, systems analysis, systems ecology, are all focused on understanding these complex systems of interconnected elements that are organized in a way that achieves something. So the boat in the picture is a system, but the lake and the shoreline and the rescue organizations that the boat is surrounded by could also be considered the system. Likewise, your factory is a system, but your business contains supply chains and other elements that is probably a better way to think about your business as a system. And for sustainability, we have to broaden these boundaries so that we include the environment and the well-being of people as well. Okay, but systems dynamics has focused a lot on the challenges of understanding and managing complex systems, and there's a whole list of characteristics that make a system, whether it's your business system or anything else, difficult. And I'm going to pick out just a couple of these to illustrate a way of thinking and a way of analyzing our decisions and interventions so that we are trying to assure that they're not resulting in negative unintended consequences. So let me start with positive and negative feedbacks. I'm going to just jump into an example here to illustrate this. This is a positive feedback cycle that plays out in many different areas, and many different organizations would approach sustainability of water use in this way. So we have an effort going on at conservation of water. Why are we doing this? Because this community realized that it was using too much water and their water resources were going down, and they were worried about where they were going to get it in the future. So they started to invest in conservation of water, and they saw great results, great water efficiency results. That led to a recognition and an awareness of the positive results, which then continued to encourage public support for that water conservation, which then led to more conservation. So that's a positive feedback cycle. That's sometimes called a virtuous cycle, sometimes called a reinforcing feedback process. And over on the right, what resulted was that because of the water efficiency results, they took less total water from the rivers, and they had more stream flows that they could count on for the long term. So that's a great success story there, seemed to work. But one problem for them is that their boundary around their system wasn't quite wide enough. What happened in this situation is that because there was less total water being taken from the rivers, there was more available water for new businesses and new homes to come in, and they came in. They came into the region, and that increased total water demand, and that increased the amount of water taken from rivers and led to lower stream flows. So that was a negative feedback, a balancing feedback cycle that unfortunately led to that original effort to increase sustainability of water use to be not successful. These kinds of things happen everywhere. Another quick example of that, this is an example, we're in a community where they're a very underprivileged community, where a lot of people don't have access to services and to schools and playgrounds and hospitals and so forth. The leaders in this area, the government, the non-governmental organizations, and corporations decided to invest in improving infrastructure and services. That led to an increase in the well-being of the community residents, so exactly what they wanted to do. And that led to more support, a success story, and a continued government, NGO, and corporate investment. Another positive feedback cycle, another reinforcing one, another virtuous cycle. But when others outside that region who were still underprivileged found out about it, they saw the signs of well-being, and they moved to the region so that they could have access to that infrastructure and services. And what happened then is that once again, that community did not have enough infrastructure and services to meet the needs of the people. So the positive feedback was pushed back by the negative feedback. These kinds of feedback cycles happen everywhere, and they're so common that they fall into an archetype that's called fixes that fail. You have a problem, you put a fix in place, you solve the problem for a while, but then you get unintended consequences. And part of the problem is the scale at which you're looking, the boundaries that you have around your system are too small. And there are lots of these kinds of feedback cycles that happen over and over again in municipalities, in communities of all kinds, in companies, in all kinds of organizations. The good thing about it is they happen so often that there's a list of them now. There's like 10 different archetypes for these feedbacks that will get in the way of efforts to shift towards a sustainability goal. And you can manage for those kinds of feedback situations if you're aware of them. So this is an area that we could go into a lot more deeply, but I want to move on very quickly to a couple of other issues. Another challenge that we run into as we're trying to manage these complex systems for sustainability is that there's all kinds of connections that take place across space and time, and there's a lot of invisibilities. There's a lot of situations where what I do as a citizen is having impacts far, far away, and I don't even realize it. So invisibilities. So we sometimes get in trouble because of that when cause and effect are distant in time or in space, and when solutions require actions at a number of different scales. So let me give you a quick example of this, a fascinating example that has some solutions embedded now, and that is an example around palm oil. So I'm drawing here on work by one of my colleagues here, Jim Leap, at Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment. So palm oil is an ingredient in half of the products in the grocery store. We all use it all the time in many different kinds of purchases that we make. If you go through the long supply chain, you can ask the question, where does that palm oil originate from? What is needed at the base of the supply chain for that? And the answer is it comes from palm oil plants, from palm plantations. 50% of the palm plantations in the world around that are in Indonesia. There's maybe another third in Malaysia, or at least the palm oil's coming from Malaysian plantations. And palm oil plantations are also expanding now into parts of Central and Eastern Africa and Latin America. So that's fine. That's an agricultural crop that is needed. But there are a couple problems with it. One is that most of the palm plantations were originally and quite recently tropical forests with very heavy peat soils that have a lot of carbon in it. And as those forests are burned to be converted into plantations, they emit huge amounts of air pollutants. And so you see pictures, I'm sure you've seen pictures of people living in downwind cities with masks on because they're suffering from air pollution from the biomass burning, but they also emit a lot of greenhouse gases. And then, of concern to many communities is that they are a threat to biodiversity. There's a threat of extinction. This is a graphic from the World Wildlife Fund focusing on a species that is under huge stress because of deforestation related to palm oil. So the question then is, what do we do about that? How do we meet the needs for palm oil without those negative consequences? That question was addressed, it has been a big problem that has been approached very slowly over time, but is growing right now in terms of the action. So going back to 2001, a small Swiss retailer, Migros, got together with a couple of conservation organizations, non-governmental organizations, to create, and then they brought stakeholders together to create a certification system. They developed a roundtable on palm oil, and they created together a set of standards that would allow for palm oil to be certified sustainable. So that was an important first step, seemed to make sense. The next step was that they then, and other NGOs came in at this point, tried to engage some of the biggest corporations in the world who source palm oil from palm plantations. And the first one to be brought in was Unilever. Not surprisingly, Unilever has a long record of social responsibility, and they agreed that they wanted to use certified palm oil and not have deforestation occurring. And then over time, many, many other players have come in. There's a true partnership among these corporations as they seek to source palm oil from systems where deforestation was not a factor. So that story goes on too, but it's a nice example of how partnerships can come together to work towards sustainability. I'm going to move on past this next characteristic, although it's a fascinating one, and wrap this up. So we have a lot of complexity out there as we are trying to work towards long-term intergenerational human well-being. And it would be nice if we could say there's one great set of models, or simulation models or whatever, that all you have to do is put in an intervention, and the model will tell you whether you're going to have unintended negative consequences or not. The model will tell you if it's a smart move to make or not. Unfortunately, no such integrated systems model exists, and if there were, we probably wouldn't believe it. Too complex. But there are lots of tools that we can use. This is a list of some of them. Many of these are used right now by corporations that are trying to make sure that they have sustainable supply chains, and many more could be used in the future. In our discussions and courses here, we can dive into these with some detail and give examples of how these different tools are actually used to help decision makers make good decisions for sustainability. But the bottom line is we're going to need a lot of humility. We're trying to do something that is new. We're going to get some things wrong. We need to be able to monitor how well we're doing, to learn from our mistakes as well as our successes, and to adapt as we go. So with that, I want to just end by saying that we in our programs here at Stanford believe that there are three really important characteristics of leaders for sustainability, leaders in businesses, NGOs, academic institutions, governments. First of all, the ability to understand these complex systems, which we've just been talking about, and to make decisions recognizing those 5 capital assets. The second is the mindset and the capacity to lead in this very dynamic world. And Julia Novy-Hildesley, a professor of practice here, will be speaking on this topic later in May at a webinar. And finally, the ability to design innovations that can scale, that can lead to change at a scale that matters. And Professor of Practice Bani Banerjee will be giving a webinar on that topic also later in May. So with that, I thank you very much for listening, for being part of this discussion, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Pamela. This was a fascinating conversation. And so with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Pam with a few questions that have come up. And so, Pam, the first question I'd like to ask you is, we've talked about all these very complex systems. Of all these activities, which industry do you think is most meaningful to intervene in? Is this most relevant to the public sector, the private sector, et cetera? What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I think I have to say all of the above. I think there's a role for everyone. When I teach these courses at Stanford to the up-and-coming leaders of the future, I'm basically saying it doesn't matter where you're going in your life. You have an important role to play in this, and whether you're going into nonprofits or governments or corporations of all kinds, it matters. You know, I think as we look at some of the big challenges today, meeting the energy needs of people, meeting the food needs of people are huge, and all of the industries and corporations and companies engaged in doing those things have a role to play. I think ultimately that example that I showed of the palm oil certification program is maybe the way of the future. I think more and more corporations and industries are going to be working together to try to find even level playing fields in which they can do good for themselves as well as do good for the world. But there's no doubt that we're going to need a lot more food, energy, water resources, and we're going to have to find ways to provide them much, much more efficiently in order to sustain for the long term.
Thank you. So another thread of questions that I'm seeing come up is around the different type of intervention or education or activity may be needed in first world countries or more affluent societies and maybe third world or less affluent societies. How are the needs in these two areas different? I'm sure both need some kind of intervention and education.
Right. Well, it's an interesting question because I think, obviously in the third world countries, well, let me start. In the most developed countries of the world, we still have lots of sustainability challenges. We have an opportunity to use our resources to meet the needs of people, to focus on human well-being in much better ways than we are today. So it's not like we've got it figured out. But I think what's really interesting is to see the leapfrogging in the third world, in the developing countries of the world, where companies and corporations are moving in to help the citizens of those countries, those nations, meet their needs through better health care, through more food, through better water resources, in ways that are conservative, in ways that are smart from a sustainability perspective, that are efficient, but still meets people's needs. And I think companies that are engaging right now in the developing world, in some of the poorest parts of the developing world, are among the most innovative because they have an opportunity to innovate new approaches that actually make sense both for those people right there and for the environment and for the ability for future generations to have their needs met. So it's very exciting. I think that's the part that excites me most.
Mm-hmm. So we've talked about the fact that companies typically measure their success in economic terms, and early on in the webinar you talked about the three legs of that stool. What are some examples you can give to ways companies have successfully used, what measures have they used to tap into these other components beyond the economic value?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think there's some really wonderful case studies out there. I think if you take a look at Unilever's 2020 Sustainable Living program, there's a wonderful list of ways that at every scale in that corporation they're engaging. From the product design stage where they're thinking very carefully about reducing plastics, for example, or creating new products that require less, new detergents that require less use of water. Those kinds of innovations that then will go out and be actually making a big difference to people all around the world. But then you have on the other hand companies that are trying very hard to manage their supply chains so that each part of the supply chain is actually using best practice. And that's incredibly challenging. That's where certification programs and standards become very, very helpful. But they're using life cycle assessment and other approaches to try to make sure that at every stage in the supply chain they're doing the best they can. I think that it really sustainability is something that has to engage every part of the company. It can't just be the CEO saying we should be doing this. It has to be the CEO and the C-suite on down committed to making it happen, but giving opportunities to everybody in the company to use their own innovation skills to find solutions. And many, many companies, I think, have done that with respect to how they use their own resources. They've reduced their energy use. They've reduced water use. They've reduced wastes. And they've succeeded. They've made money just because of that. And that's fantastic. But increasingly, companies are taking that perspective outside of the walls of their own factories.
Mm-hmm. All right, so you've talked a lot about the complexity of the system and how there's so many different components to each activity that we want to do. Who is ultimately accountable for that in the sense of since there's so many actors?
Yeah. Well, I think you have to put a boundary around your system and try to do your best within it. Ultimately, nobody is in control. We're talking about a global, highly interconnected system. And so a lot of this is bottom up. A lot of it is recognizing that future well-being of one's community, one's company, one's governmental organization or non-governmental organization depends on everybody doing the best thing they can. That's one of the reasons I think the coalitions, the partnerships that are being developed is so exciting, because there is no government for the globe saying you must do this. It has to come from the bottom up. That said, the UN's Sustainable Development Goals that I mentioned at the very beginning provide an impetus for that. They've identified really hugely important areas that need to be solved in the developing world, and for companies to think about those goals and to recognize that these are opportunities for them to play in an emerging market, if you will, but to also help solve those problems. That's the exciting combination.
Yeah, that's really wonderful. So I think there are a lot of people on the line today that are realizing that this is a very, very important topic and would like to do more to convince potentially some others within their organization how important this is. What are some hooks or some strategies that you would use to help them make that argument?
Yeah, very good question, and that's probably one that the next two speakers in our series will be able to address much better than I. Because they're more focused on business settings than I have been. But that said, I think we used to think about training people to be the sustainability director or the environment director in an organization, and that's still very, very important. Those people play very, very important roles. But we also want the top leaders to get it. And one of the big challenges is how to engage them. That's one of the reasons that we're launching this executive education program, because from the very top we want people to understand both the challenge and the opportunity for their company. I think the companies that have engaged probably most effectively have had both leaders at the bottom and at the top who've worked together, and they've empowered their employees to be innovative and to engage at every stage, at every part of the organization, so it becomes an organization-wide effort. And I think the payoff is pretty great for those, both in terms of maintaining and retaining great employees, but also in terms of their own profitability and social responsibility.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think one thing that might be embedded in what you said, which we can call out more explicitly, is really talking about both the challenges and the opportunities. When you hear of all these different, the growing population and the growth in consumption, it's very easy to think about the challenges and be a little demoralized, but I think there's also a lot of opportunities that could be called out as a result of that.
Oh, absolutely, and I do believe that there are many, many corporations in the world who see the opportunity. But I'm glad that many of them see the opportunity not just to, have a much larger consumer base, but to do it right with that consumer base so that there's a long-term benefit as well as a short-term profit.
Well, good. So we're nearing the top of the hour. I think this webinar potentially and hopefully has left all of you on the line with an appetite and curiosity to learn more about this and to dive deeper into some of the ways that we can actually affect change as a result of all of the complex challenges that we face as a species, really, and as a planet. And I think there will be different opportunities to do that. So as Pamela mentioned, there are 2 webinars that will be coming up in May that will be led by Professor Julia Novi-Hildesley as well as Professor Danny Banerjee. Both of these will be talking and touching in more depth of some of these topics that have been discussed today. In addition, of course, we invite you to join us in September to learn more about this in person here on campus. As a reminder, the recording of this webinar will be emailed to all of you within a week so that you can review it again and share with colleagues and friends. And we will also be sending you some additional information about other opportunities to engage with us. With that, I want to wish you a very good day, and thank you for joining us today.